In the spring of 1956, Oxford Fellow and ingenious philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe vigorously opposed Oxford's intention to bestow an honorary degree on former President Harry S. Truman. Citing just war tradition, she asked, "If you do this, what Nero, what Genghis Khan, what Hitler, or what Stalin will not be honored in the future?" With a vote being scheduled to decide the matter, those who disagreed with Anscombe whispered, "The women are up to something. We have to go and vote them down." Professor Benjamin Lipscomb on Elizabeth Anscombe, Iris Murdoch, Mary Midgely, and Phillipa Foot in his book, The Women Are Up to Something, Now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture podcast from Word on Fire. Professor Benjamin Lipscomb is a professor of philosophy and director of the honors program at Houghton University. With a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, Professor Lipscomb specializes in contemporary ethical theory with additional interests in American agrarianism, biomedical ethics, and the history of philosophy. He has co-edited a collection on Immanuel Kant, and most recently has written The Women Are Up to Something, a work exploring the friendship and ideas of four brilliant female Oxford thinkers, Iris Murdoch, Elizabeth Anscombe, Mary Midgely, and Phillipa Foot. Professor Lipscomb, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Segment 1. Nothing is ever going to be the same again. In the wake of Victory in Europe Day, newsreels at the British cinema began to show images of the horrific Nazi concentration camps. Oxford graduate and budding philosopher Phillipa Foot took in the piles of bodies, the remains charred in ovens or tangled in electrified wires, the emaciated survivors stumbling around in a daze, the adolescents clutching the bowls of thin soup they had been given, flinching instinctively as anyone approached. When Foot emerged, shocked by what she saw, she found herself sitting across from her Oxford mentor, Donald MacKinnon, whispering, "Nothing is ever going to be the same again." Ben, how did the war change philosophy for Phillipa Foot?
Yeah, this is something that took a while to bear fruit in her philosophical work, but she says in a number of interviews late in her life that this was this pivotal moment for her, that she finally went to see these films, which screened far longer than the newsreels in the cinemas ordinarily did, that ordinarily you'd have a cycle of a week or two. And these went for months and months, and people were talking about it as a civic duty that we need to confront this. So she sees them finally, best as I can put together, in September when they'd come out in April. But she'd been getting married and moving and one thing and another. But as soon as she sees them, she thinks the kind of ethics that's being done at Oxford, the kind of ethics I've been exposed to in my philosophical training, is totally inadequate to this. It does not have a language adequate to this kind of evil. Whatever's correct in ethics, it can't be what I was taught. It can't be what I studied. And I know we'll get into the details of that, but she felt like we need a new conceptual vocabulary. We need a better way of talking about this. We need to be able to come to grips with it.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm so excited to have you on because it's this, I think plenty of people who find philosophy somewhat daunting and somewhat kind of opaque in terms of their ability to completely apprehend it. They like to ask, what is the relevance of philosophy to my daily life? And we're going to explore that as we go through here. Let's indeed take a step back and let's explore the milieu in which Phillipa Foot and other subjects in your book were educated, namely Oxford in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. How would you describe Oxford's educational culture, and how did women figure into it?
Well, the educational culture is, for anyone who's educated in the United States, it takes a little getting your head around that it's a collegiate system where your dormitory, as an American would think of it, is a semi-autonomous institution that's part of this federation of Oxford. And you have regular advising meetings, tutorials, with particular faculty in a variety of disciplines, depending on what it is that you're studying. But then you're examined totally independently, the tutorial and examination system. So this is how it works, and you form these intense mentoring relationships, which ended up being really, really important for these women, who they got to work with during the war. But It's a clubby,
Mm,
chummy world built for men.
yeah.
In the 19th century, all of the dons, as the professors are known, are bachelors. And the whole world is kind of built around that, with mid-evening supper time wine gatherings and parties. And it's not designed for women. And indeed, by statute, the number of women in the few women's colleges that educational reformers had started in the late 19th century, it's limited so that the women won't come to too large of a percentage. I've got this quote in the book that I ran across in my research where the dean of Somerville College, the
Hmm.
kind of elite women's college among the 4 or 5 that there were at the time, said to the entering class when Iris Murdoch and Mary Midgely were coming up, look, you might think it doesn't matter how you behave, but it does. The women are on probation at this
Yeah.
university still. We don't want to lose our reputation. Behave yourselves. You stand for all women, whether you want to or not.
Right. It's unbelievable. And you did a really good job of really highlighting with the men going off to war and certain opportunities arising for women to go in, even though they still didn't have an equal shot, going in. The numbers that were being allowed and so on were still small. It just let a person know just how difficult it was both to get in, to stay in. The standards were very different for the two of them, and for men versus women. This was the ground from which these four women and their ideas sprang. And so, yeah, it sounds like it was not an easy life.
No, it wasn't. I mean, they found it delightful,
Hmm.
and it was the only university experience they had. And so, we experienced this a lot, that the only thing you think of it as normal. But looking back, Mary Midgely, who was more interested in doing memoir than any of the others, identified this as really formative for them. Looking back and realizing, wait, the whole place emptied out. Most of the men enlisted or were conscripted. And who were we left with as our professors?
Yeah.
Eastern European emigres who were fleeing from the Nazis, and conscientious objectors, and some disabled people. And these were our teachers.
Yeah.
Um, and it's a really different portfolio of people that they were interacting with. And certainly they had more opportunities to raise their voices, because the men who would have drawn the attention of their mentors a half decade before, just because, the kind of people you're used to working with as a teacher,
Mm.
you're instinctively going to be most comfortable with. And so I don't think they would have drawn the kind of mentorship that they did. And the array of teachers that were available to them was distinctive and a little different at this moment, because they all start university right as the war's breaking out.
Yeah, this is, and I want to say also we've used a couple of names already that we're going to talk about more in depth here, and I'd like to talk about them. There's four women here that your book, "The Women Are Up to Something," focuses on, from different backgrounds, different personalities, and they emerge on the Oxford scene. And for simplicity, I'll use the names for which they are best known, because some of these people are referred to by their maiden name until they get married and so on. But we have Iris Murdoch, Elizabeth Anscombe, Phillipa Foot, and Mary Midgely. Let's talk about each one of them, if you don't mind, just to give people a little sketch. Let's start with Iris Murdoch. Tell us a little bit about Iris Murdoch.
Okay. She is the only and beloved child of this English civil servant and his Irish wife. They move over to England, and they're always a little bit displaced persons. She became fascinated with and a great friend and benefactor to a variety of displaced persons later in her life. But they have this little world within the world
Mm-hmm.
in southwest London as she's growing up. And when she goes off first to badminton school and then to Somerville College at Oxford, she is this person who's been intensely cultivated by her parents and who is tremendously idealistic. She knows from pretty early on that she wants to be a writer, maybe a novelist someday. And she's also, like a number of her peers at that time, fired up by the stuff already happening in Abyssinia and Spain. She is a communist, as red as red, and sees herself as living at a pivotal juncture in history. I think reading about her, she reminds me of a lot of students that I encounter and read about in the present moment, just on fire
Yeah.
for politics and wanting to know what she can give herself to absolutely. So I don't know how far you want me to go into her biography, but she becomes that novelist, and that's what she's most famous for, but also a really distinguished and imaginative philosopher.
She's also and maybe say a word or two. When I'm reading this story, it's amazing. I wrote a couple words down by each one of their names, kind of in the front of the book for my kind of almost. I don't want to be kind of categorizing them overly simplistically, but she was as you said, fiery. There was a lot of drama in her life. There were a lot of relationships that were tried and tested, that were gained and that were lost. She seemed like she had a very tumultuous life in its own way. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. That she falls in love easily and seems to have this magnetic
Mm.
pull for people around her. She and Phillipa Foot lived together in this grungy, beat up apartment in an old warehouse during the Second World War after they graduate. And one evening they're sitting around in the dim of the only light that they've got with their blackout curtains up to stop the bombers from seeing them. And they decide to pass the time by swapping stories of men who have proposed to them. Well, there's a lot of this as the war was getting going. People wanting to have someone to come back to. But so Philippa gives her list, and it's, a few people. And then Iris starts and continues and continues. And finally, Philippa, in annoyance, says, maybe it would save time if you say who hasn't proposed to you. But yeah, Murdoch, yes, has this capacity. I don't want to call it a gift because it's a curse to her as well as a
Mm.
gift of falling in love and being fallen in love with her teachers, with her
Yeah.
peers, with colleagues. She's in love at various points with her friends, Elizabeth
Yeah.
Anscombe and
Yeah.
Phillipa Foot, um, and finally settles down
Yeah.
to everyone's shock in the 1950s with this fairly staid
Mm.
English professor,
Mm.
John Bailey. But tumultuous is a good descriptor for her love life through her 40s or 50s even.
Yeah, and those of you who get a chance, please read this book because it is such an extraordinary sketch, not only of philosophy but of character. And these are the characters that we find in these women. It's a fascinating unfolding of human nature. Let's move on to Philippa Foot. Tell us a little bit about her.
Okay, so she comes from quite a different class from any of her peers in this group. That she's the granddaughter of U.S. President Grover
Mm.
Cleveland, and so her mother is the last baby. I think I have this on authority. Was the last baby born in the White House,
Mm.
not to a sitting president, but like actually delivered in the White House. And Esther goes over to do her bit during the First World War as a nurse and meets the younger son of a British aristocrat, William Bosanquet, and Captain Bosanquet of the Coldstream Guards and Esther Cleveland fall in love and are married in Westminster Abbey. It's that kind
Yeah.
of family. So she's raised in North Yorkshire, where he's not going to inherit the estate and the title. So he ends up running a steelworks in North Yorkshire, being this more entrepreneurial figure. And she's raised in this manor house with governesses and riding to hounds and not being allowed to play with most of the children in the village because she's above them. She hardly knows her parents. Later on, I think she feels real pangs about this and wants to connect and tries to connect with them. But it's a strange childhood from another world than mine and most of my readers. So her coming to Oxford was unexpected and unwanted as far as her family was concerned. They let her do it, but it was not the thing that her people did.
Right.
And she, from early on, for reasons that are a little hard to trace, wants to escape this background of privilege. She, all her life, is giving herself to causes like Oxfam, which she's involved with very early on in its history, that enable her to do something, I think, to kind of live down the privilege of her childhood.
Yeah. Yeah, for a Foot, as I'm reading her, I was just struck by what a background she had, and yet she was a workhorse. I mean, she struck me that she was just pounding the pavement, working hard, devoting herself to causes. It sort of ran a little bit, again, in the different direction from what you would have thought she was bred to the kind of life she was bred to live. And obviously, as a philosophical thinker, as a friend, as a devotee to causes, and as just a person who knows how to work hard. She struck me as very intriguing in that respect.
So driven.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it does have to do with a sense of making up for something, wanting her life to mean more than she felt like the lives of her parents set meant.
Yeah, that's great. Elizabeth Anscombe, many of our listeners might be familiar with her, but please talk about this enormous character, Elizabeth Anscombe.
Yeah, she's a teenage convert to Catholicism. She's born to a nominally Anglican family and starts a program of reading. Some of the accounts have her picking up Chesterton and other authors while she's on vacation with some family in Normandy. And she realizes she thinks this is true and she'd better pray. So she's set on a path to conversion that her parents are not happy about because there's tremendous anti-Catholic prejudice in Great Britain at this time. And goodness, they want her to be something respectable. This makes no sense to them. They send an Anglican priest around to try to talk her back. But she is immovable, and that's a word one might use with some qualifications, not like she couldn't learn. She's always thinking and always rethinking, but when she decides that something important is at stake, she will not be moved by opprobrium. She will not be moved by consequences. That story you started out with, all of her colleagues in the whole university are like, will you please shut up? Will you please sit down? Do you have to embarrass us this way? And she says, no. The bombing of innocent people for tactical objectives is murder. This is as clear in the just war tradition. I'm astonished that my colleagues will stand for it. So she marries a fellow philosopher and a fellow recent convert shortly after getting to Oxford. Her parents threaten to withdraw financial support, but then don't in the end. And she is, by acclamation among her friends, the most brilliant of their set, and does all of this work, all of this campaigning, all of this translation of her philosophical mentor, Ludwig Wittgenstein's work, all of this highly original work in action theory and in ancient philosophy of her own, while she's raising her 7 kids.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, and her house was in utter disarray, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Iris Murdoch, who was famous among her friends as slovenly, that people would comment on what it was like her and John Bailey's house. She professed shock at the state of Anscombe's household.
I mean, I hope people, we're going to have a whole segment dedicated to Elizabeth Anscombe, but I think when you mentioned that about the Anglican priest coming around to help kind of bring Elizabeth back to the fold, I think she contested some doctrinal kind of point and almost set the Anglican priest back on his feet or on his heels. The other thing I think was when we talked about when the Oxford community was really coming down against Elizabeth Anscombe, like you said in your book, she did not have the gift of rallying people to the cause. What she had the gift for was staying strong. If she believed, your chapter on her is Elizabeth Anscombe against the world, if I remember correctly. So it's sort of, there she is shaking her fist and saying, look, whether I have a follower of 1 or 1,000, the truth is what the truth is, and she stood firm in it. That she's an incredible character to explore. Yes. Let's talk about Mary Midgely.
Mary Midgely is in some ways the quietest, the least dramatic, the most background of a character of the four. She's the daughter of a fairly comfortable middle class vicar. He had been a chaplain at a Cambridge college, and so he's a highly respected member of his profession. And I should say, they have a really interesting family life because Tom Scrutton, her maiden name was Scrutton. Tom Scrutton and his wife Leslie are very involved with a peace movement within the Anglican Communion and are very connected to Quakers and people in other peace traditions. And so they've got refugees and activists sort of coming in and out of their house. But she has this childhood on this little hobby farm that her father's rectory was set on, where she spends all her time out by the pond looking at frogs and mice and things and being propelled toward a joint interest in philosophy and in the natural world that she never left behind. The thing that fascinates me most about Midgely is how she leaves Oxford. She doesn't find an appointment there, but she gets married to this man, Jeff Midgely, and they move up to Newcastle, sort of out of the center of the British philosophical world. And she raises her three boys and is constantly broadcasting on the BBC at this time. She's much sought after as a book reviewer and commentator. She's a public intellectual already at this early stage of her career, but she leaves the academy behind for a time. And when she comes back to it, she's been reading all of these early works in the new scientific subfield of ethology, of animal behavior, and wanting to put together disciplinary perspectives in a way that she's been preparing for since her childhood. But I love this. Any late starter, she could be their patron saint.
Yes.
I don't know if there is a patron saint of late starters, if that's a thing.
Yes, let's make it.
But Mary Midgely publishes her first book in her late 50s. And from there is propelled into, I think she wrote like 18 books over the rest of her career once she figured out what she wanted to say and what field she wanted to cultivate.
We'll talk in a few minutes. We'll talk about her kind of remove up in Newcastle from the Oxford set and how that maybe was influential on her as well. Can you say just briefly, just how did the four of these women know each other? Were they crossing paths a lot? Were they intimate friends? I know I've read this, but for our listeners, tell me, just say a word or two about, I mean, I know that's the whole crux of the book, but maybe I'm not asking you to summarize all your pages, but just briefly, their intimacy with each other, if you will.
Yeah, maybe I should have said this right out of the gate, but they are all born 1919 or 1920, and so they're all, as the British put it, coming up, matriculating, getting started at Oxford at essentially the same time, just in time for another world war. And because the women's colleges are a small community within the community of Oxford, and then because it gets smaller with the departure of so many of the men at the beginning of the war, that, well, three of them go to Somerville College and all know one another around that college, where, you know, an entering class would be only, say, 50 people. And so, of course, they know one another, Phillipa Foot, Mary Midgely, and Iris Murdoch. And then Anscombe goes to St. Hugh's College, but she's in and out of the same classes, the same lectures, the same philosophical societies. So they know one another from their undergraduate days. Murdoch and Midgely are in the same year and studying the same subjects, and so they're constantly together. Foot starts a year later and overlaps with them somewhat in terms of their tutors and the lectures that they attend. They begin to get to know one another as undergraduates, and then they're thrown back together for a few years at Oxford in the late 40s as Foot and Anscombe and Murdoch are starting their careers there, and as Midgely is working on a doctorate.
Very good. Very good. It's a fascinating mix of people, kind of, and how they interact with each other over time.
And then they maintain correspondence, and the relationships develop from there. But that's the genesis.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Segment 2, the reaction. In 1936, Oxford philosopher Alfred Jules Ayer published Language, Truth, and Logic, and championed perspectives cultivated by the philosophical school known as the Vienna Circle. The circle, Ben, as you write, aspired to banish from science and philosophy any talk that went beyond empirical observation, beyond the facts. Taking their stand against the spirit of metaphysics, they embraced the opposite spirit of enlightenment and anti-metaphysical factual research. So, Ben, let's talk about the prevailing philosophical orthodoxy of Oxford in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So, names like Alfred Jules Ayer, Charles Stevenson, J.L. Austin, Richard Hare, they held great influence on the academic world. Could you say a few words about what Oxford philosophy taught under these dons?
There's a split because the standard way of training to be an academic philosopher through this period, 30s, 40s, even into the 50s, though alternate routes were becoming more available
Sure.
and more respectable, is what's known as grades, where you study ancient Greek literature, ancient Greek and Roman history, and then ancient and modern philosophy. It's an odd combination, but a fruitful one for the people who did it. So studying lots of Plato and lots of Aristotle, even though these are no longer figures who get a lot of respect in the contemporary philosophy of the time, their training is all highly classical. But the philosophical orthodoxy that's coming on is this positivist one, is this view that anyone who has read C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, it's the view that he's taking down in that book. A world reduced to physical phenomena in which anything going beyond those phenomena and a fairly straightforward discourse about objects that you can touch and taste and hear and see and do experiments on is unreal. And you have people like Ayer very concerned to clear out the nonsense. That would be their word for it. To clear out the nonsense from philosophy and make philosophy a kind of handmaiden to the empirical sciences.
Is this, I remember reading about fact value, kind of, if I'm not mistaken, was it fact value that there was, let's focus, anything that has the notion of value is sort of hogwash, unless we have an empirical fact that can be confirmed with the senses. The rest of this stuff is detail that we just sort of, is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery. These are not observation reports.
Yeah.
And so anything like this, anything that involves working to the best explanation, like, say, the cosmological argument for God's existence, working to the best explanation of the whole of reality, or any statements about how we ought to comport ourselves, any judgments about better and worse, right and wrong, because they're not observation reports, are banished to the realm of non-fact and thus banished to the realm of unreal.
Right. That's something else. And this segment is called The Reaction because we have our four women philosophers reacting against this. So starting with Iris Murdoch, she felt Ayer and the other logical positivists were too aloof and restrictive in their philosophy. And as you've written, Murdoch wanted to find a philosophy with something to say about man here and now, with definite social and emotional problems to face. The man who goes to the cinema, makes love, and fights for or against Hitler. So why was it so hard for Ayer and those prevailing philosophers to speak to the daily trials and triumphs of the man here and now?
Yeah, that's a quote from a research proposal that she did in the 1940s as she's laying out her project. She was so politically engaged, as we talked about already, and a philosophy that proposes only to speak about the deliverances of the hard sciences has nothing to say that could guide someone in thinking, how shall I devote my energies? What causes shall I give myself to? What compromises? I mean, a lot of people who were far left in this period, as they started to become aware of what Stalin had done,
Yeah.
asked themselves, okay, who am I willing to travel along with? What can I countenance in the name of grand historical outcomes? So the philosophy, just by design, by principle, had nothing to say about
Right.
this. And she thought there's got to be something more. She becomes really fascinated with the work that the existentialist philosophers in France are doing, because it seems to her to be about politics, to at
Mm.
least be trying to address the concerns of her generation.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Ayer type of mindset immediately to me gets stuck in an ivory tower. It's sort of this let's kind of a parlor game, or just kind of a very overly nuanced factual exercise that just doesn't play out in daily life. Which at the end of the day comes back to the notion of the relevance of philosophy to daily life, which we'll follow up with that question further down the road. Let's talk about Elizabeth Anscombe. She detested, as you said, J.L. Austin. And as you've written, she was maddened by Austin's lightness and his unseriousness. As a friend of Anscombe's noted, Elizabeth longed to wipe the grin off his face. Could you explore further Anscombe's antipathy towards Austin and how that antipathy, in fact, influenced Anscombe's own work?
Yeah, if it's all right, I want to back up and say something contrasting Ayer with Austin, because there is something flippant about a lot of Ayer's dismissal of everything
Yeah.
except what he thought he could speak of meaningfully, of all
Hmm.
this stuff that he classed as nonsense. At the same time, I think there's a deep metaphysical urge to a view like his, that people think when they take this view that, yeah, all values are unreal, all that stuff is just talk,
Mm.
it's just nonsense that we make up. I think there's something that's not ivory tower about that.
Mm, sure.
There's a sense that we're being brave, that we're facing facts, that we're letting ourselves see how bleak it is, that we're staring into the abyss. And
Mm.
there's a kind of a pull there that no matter how awful it is, I'm going to face it. And if there's nothing meaningful I can say about ethics, well, I'll just have to face the world and face life without
Yeah.
those consolations. And I think you get that, if not in Ayer himself, then in some of his peers. But Austin's another animal. uh, Austin, and let me be fair to him too, that he looked back at the history of philosophy and looked at all these systems, Plato's Republic and Leibniz's crystalline view of all of these little monads that somehow make up the world, the best of all possible worlds. And he thought, we've abandoned one of these after another, after another, after another. How can I do something that will last?
Mm.
And Austin, I just put my hands when I was in England last week. It's about to come out, this full dress biography of Austin, who was a military intelligence officer during the
Oh, wow.
war and did crucial work in interpreting the data coming in that enabled the D-Day invasion
Oh,
to be a
wow.
success.
Wow.
And that kind of patient sifting of little details with
Mm.
a team of other intelligent people, he thought, could we build something that will last in philosophy if we worked like that? If we just assembled minutiae and
Yeah.
slowly saw what kind of patterns might emerge. So he devoted himself with his peers to the analysis of ordinary language with the thought, if we get our concepts clear,
Mm.
if we ask ourselves, what precisely do our words mean? What are their exact connotations and implications? We may not build something grand, but we'll build something that will last.
Wow. Wow. So let me thank you for clarifying that. And that's really helpful about the notion that no, this actually does not become an academic ivory tower irrelevancy. It becomes uh, for many people what they feel is a hard truth compass by which to kind of navigate through the world. So when you were talking about Ayer, could you come
And
back?
look, absolutely, Anscombe looking at Austin's little Saturday morning gatherings in which they sift through various shades and flavors of excuses. She's like, oh my goodness, this is how you're spending your time. But I think it is important that we get inside it as a matter of charity and say, what was the appeal for
Yeah.
him besides good fun with friends on a Saturday morning? But go
So,
ahead.
so no, no, this is great. Tell me then. So in Anscombe's sort of disdain, if you will, for Austen, how did she then respond? How did that shape her philosophically? Was it just she ran in the opposite direction of what Austen was doing effectively, or what would you say about that?
It's difficult to say because there are actually certain overlaps between the thought of her mentor Wittgenstein,
Mm-hmm.
who wanted us to attend to our language and how it's really used in a way that's highly reminiscent
Yeah.
of some of what Austen was doing. I think the clearest thing to say is something that Mary Warnock, Anscombe's estranged pupil, said that in part it was a matter of tone, that she wanted to make her life and her work a quest for truth. And she saw the gamesmanship of Austen as antithetical to the way she wanted to approach this subject. Maybe this is how I can come at it to make it clearest. Her mentor, Wittgenstein, saw people as getting trapped, imprisoned by their philosophical thoughts, by their theories, that people could believe that language worked a certain way. I mean, take Ayer's views about what meaningful language could consist in or couldn't, that the only thing you could speak meaningfully of were the deliverances of the sciences. Wittgenstein thought people could get trapped inside pictures of the world like that, and he sought to liberate them, to help them see this thing you see as inevitable, it's not inevitable, and getting inside how our words can constrict us, can constrict our thoughts. He was seeking liberation for himself and for his pupils. You don't have to think the way you think. You can break out of these boxes. And Anscombe thought of philosophy the way Wittgenstein of philosophy. It was there to liberate us from too easy, too quick presuppositions. But she definitely wanted to turn this to ethical and other purposes that Austen, the analysis of language, he was content, if God had given him so long, to spend 50, 70 years doing this picking apart of little nuances of meaning. And for Anscombe, the whole point of thinking in that careful, nuanced way about what we mean when we say you intended an action is to say, okay, can Truman be said to have intended the deaths of the ordinary people, of the civilians at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when he wrote his name at the bottom of a piece of paper?
Wow. Very good. Very good. Phillipa Foot, she found herself caught up in conventional thinking, compartmentalization, and daily resistances to the developing philosophy of her friend and mentor, Elizabeth Anscombe. When she finally picked up a work from Anscombe's mentor, as you've mentioned, Ludwig Wittgenstein, it was like a conversion for her. How did Phillipa Foot change?
There's a couple of conversions that happened for Foot under Anscombe's influence. The one Anscombe most wanted, to convert her to Christianity, she didn't succeed in, and it bothered her. Because Foot, just slightly junior to Anscombe, latched onto Anscombe, attached herself to Anscombe as her philosophical mentor, the way Anscombe had attached herself to Wittgenstein. And they would sit every afternoon as colleagues at Somerville and do philosophy together for hours. So the first thing that Anscombe converts Foot to is this Wittgensteinian philosophical method, this patient unpacking of one's own presuppositions, asking, why do I think the way I think? Are my words, are my ideas boxing me in? A kind of self-therapy through moving very, very slowly through one's own mental structure. And taking apart one's presuppositions, calling them into question. So there's that methodological point that was a big breakthrough moment for Foot in ethics. You read Foot's earliest ethical writings, and you'd be surprised that this is the woman who's later going to say, once I saw those films from Bergen-Belsen, I knew that Ayer couldn't be right, that ethics had to be different than he said, just a bunch of meaningless noise. But she writes quite conventional stuff about ethics through her first few published articles. But then she recounts one day she was sitting of an afternoon talking over tea with Anscombe, and Foot says, I made some remark about the distinction between factual description and evaluation. And Anscombe said, what? What? And Foot said, wait, I'm allowed to say what to that? I don't have to take that for granted. And I don't know, for someone who doesn't inhabit the world of philosophy, I think this is true of all of us.
Yeah.
There's all this common sense.
Yeah.
All these things that we say because we're used to hearing them said, and we don't pause to query them. And what Wittgenstein was great at, and what Anscombe taught Foot to do, was to say, well, really? About even the most basic seeming presuppositions. And then later on, Anscombe puts Foot on to Thomas Aquinas's Secunda Secundae, to the account of the particular virtues and vices. And like scales falling from her eyes, she thinks, this is how you can do ethics. This is how you can be talking about the facts and describing the world and be thinking about the best life for human beings.
When we go to the next segment, we're going to talk about those two very examples that put her onto Aquinas, and about the epiphany moment, which I love. The Anscombe-Foot relationship is so captivating and almost strikes me as the heart of the relationship of these four women. Again, they're all fascinating in their own rights, but the Anscombe-Foot axis is especially fascinating. Mary Midgely fully developed as a broad-minded thinker sometime after she left Oxford, as you've mentioned. A synthesizing generalist, a public intellectual living in Scotland, she was formed, it seems in part, by what she described as, quote, the fairly awful piece of intellectual snobbery, end quote, that Oxford types betrayed in their condescensions over her distance from Oxford's high society. How did Midgley's experiences in the trenches of life mold her philosophy?
Yeah, she found in her couple of university appointments that she did hold, first slightly before her marriage and moved to Newcastle at the University of Reading, she found that she had these colleagues that she was talking to. She wasn't surrounded by philosophers. She wasn't doing all her thinking in philosophical gatherings, but talking to the English literature professors and the biologists at Reading. And she always had a hard time containing her interests to one little narrow band, and she likened herself to Aristotle in this regard. Aristotle's intellectually omnivorous. He wrote about everything. And Midgley thought, well, of course, philosophy is for the integration of our thoughts in a variety of domains into some kind of consistent, coherent picture. She compares the task of the philosopher to that of the plumber, straightening out all the connections between the parts of the house, making things function together. And so her experiences at smaller universities with smaller faculties was crucial to this. And then she'll say, as she starts thinking about the connections between ethics and animal behavior, between ethics and biology, you know, what does it mean for ethics that we are the kinds of animals we are, that we are members of the species that we are rational animals? She says that she learned a lot by watching her kids playing on the hearthrug, that she was seeing all this animal behavior, that you can't watch children and not think they are little animals who are growing up and growing into their potential. And she says she was always thinking about what she was seeing right in front of her as she's raising her boys.
You know, it's interesting, too, because as you've described the different philosophers here, Midgely was the one that struck me most, again, if it's fair to say, as the generalist. She, in a modern
Yes.
world, even the mid 20th century, a world where there's plenty of reductionism, plenty of specialization, plenty of very, very narrow focuses, which we need for people to kind of discern and solve problems and so on. We also need sometimes the great overarching, big picture, synthesizing generalist that can kind of come back to the notion of why does this stuff matter and how does it matter to the person out in the general streets.
Yeah, that's crucial. All four of them are people who do philosophy that's oriented toward
Mm.
orienting us in the world, and could be capacious in their interests. But no, it's Midgely above all the others who positions herself as a public intellectual and who says this is what philosophy is for. Philosophy is for helping us to organize our thoughts about computers and nuclear weapons and our relationship to non-human animals and everything.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Miss Anscombe. Elizabeth Anscombe, you write, drew a firm distinction between what mattered and what didn't. She then devoted herself unreservedly to what mattered, and she spent as little energy as possible on what didn't. The Oxford rule requiring women to wear skirts while they lectured didn't matter. On the morning of class, Anscombe would bring along a skirt and pull it on over her trousers outside the lecture room door. I am a great stickler for convention and propriety, she remarked to one bystander as she stepped into the required uniform. So, I mean, come on. I mean, how do you not love this woman? So, Ben, what was it about the mind and the character and frankly the stinging wit of Elizabeth Anscombe that makes her so endlessly fascinating?
Yeah, I mean, she is utterly unconventional in self-presentation. I have to think that her conversion experience prepared her for this in some ways, that she was standing against her social world from very, very early on. And that's a fortifying experience. Once you learn in your late teens that you can do this, but it's in her temperament too, that we have stories about how much of an argumentative cuss she could be, how combative she could be, defending a point in conversation with her father. So she's always a little bit pugilistic. But when she feels like something important is at stake, she will not let go of it. But she is delightful. That what she doesn't see as signifying anything particularly important, she's just not going to give it any of her emotional or mental energy. And yeah, there are so many Anscombe stories. It's hard to pick.
Yeah, we love our characters, but for a genius, philosophical Catholic genius, who can also be unbelievably witty, unbelievably unconventional, and just have story after story that just makes you laugh. You don't find many people like that, and she's one of them. You've mentioned Ludwig Wittgenstein several times. For those who are unfamiliar, can you just give a couple of words about who he was? And I know, again, I'm asking you these. You could write books about these, obviously, but a little bit about who he was, and it takes a lot for someone like Elizabeth Anscombe to be a devotee to somebody. She has to respect that person, and she clearly had unbelievable devotion to the life and the thought of Wittgenstein. Who was Wittgenstein, and who was he to Anscombe?
Good. Yeah, Wittgenstein's an Austrian emigre, comes from this family of tremendous wealth and this family of prodigies. His brother Paul is a world-renowned concert pianist who then loses his hand in World War One. But
Mm.
the family hangs out with Klimt and Ravel and others, and so Paul Wittgenstein commissions Ravel to write him a piano concerto for the left hand,
Wow.
so that he can be and he retains the rights to be the only performer of this during his lifetime, and he continues his career as a performer. So Wittgenstein comes from this very high powered, very high pressure family, and he's kind of tormented his whole life. He's got siblings who commit suicide, and he has dark nights of the soul himself. Comes to England uh, in the early 19 teens to study mathematics and philosophy with Bertrand Russell there, and then goes off to World War One, and while he's there, accomplishes the first of two revolutions in 20th century philosophy. That he's one of the progenitors. He's one of the people responsible for the philosophical articulation of Ayer's view. He's
Hmm.
one of the people under whose spell Ayer comes, because at first he goes in for this view that the only things we can speak about are the arrangements of objects in the world. That's the only kind of meaningful discourse there could be. And he gives an articulation to that that's more compelling than anyone else's. And the Vienna Circle and Ayer and others latch hold of this.
Hmm.
And then he shows this tremendous capacity. I mean, I should say, just because it's an amazing story, he's under fire in an Austrian artillery unit as he's jotting down these thoughts about the crystalline structure of the world of
Oh my
facts.
gosh.
This is how he's consoling himself, what he's working on. And then he has the courage and the imagination to walk it all back,
Mm.
to decide that's a false picture.
Mm.
That's not how language really
Wow.
works. There is more to life in the world than that. And he spends the second half of his career patiently taking apart his own view. And in his later writings, he will sometimes refer to himself in the third person as the author of the Tractatus. That guy who thought that stuff that I now repudiate,
Wow.
in favor of a view that grounds us as a certain kind of animal in the world, whose language is one of our tools for navigating and negotiating that world. So here's the key to his relationship with Anscombe. She's a person too, because she's so committed to the truth. She's gripped by
Mm. Mm.
philosophical questions, even when they aren't about the faith, even when they aren't about matters of life and death. She's just a person who can get a bug biting her about whether every event we observe has to have a cause,
Mm.
and won't be able to let go of this thought. Well, does it or doesn't it? And she's gripped by these questions, and sometimes she's gripped by them in ways that she'll later see to be unnecessary. But it's Wittgenstein who manifests to her both the integrity to question anything you've been assuming, and who had been gripped by some of the same thoughts that she had about what's inevitable, about what you have to think, about what you can't but think. And he helps her to a kind of therapeutic release. I want to be really careful not to say this like it's a real diagnosis. I'm
Mm.
not a
Mm.
professional here, but she sometimes seems to be a person who gets canalized, as I think people say, where she's just running the script and she can't let go of this thought, and she can't stop turning over and over and over this thought in her mind. And Wittgenstein liberates her from some of these canalizing thoughts and is devoted to letting go of what he can let go of. And she finds him really liberating in that way. She thinks, here's somebody who can teach me to question anything, and who is as relentlessly and uncompromisingly and unconventionally honest as anyone I've known in my life.
That's and if it, as a non-philosopher, it strikes me that that has to be at the heart of the work, is that you're willing to repudiate yourself or your original thoughts if you come across truths that counter what you once formerly thought was true. There's a great line, I think, from the economist John Maynard Keynes. It might be an apocryphal line, but when he went kind of ran a little bit afoul of one of his original theories, was criticized for inconsistency, and he said, "Well, when the facts change, I change with them. What do you do, sir?" And to some extent, it strikes me that Anscombe's, like you've said, that the ability for her to say, question the premises upon which you are actually thinking about something and be willing to change if the truth leads you in a different direction. It seems like that's sort of what she passed on to Foot, that Wittgenstein kind of
Yes.
passed on to her. Is that fair to
Yeah,
say?
that is fair to say. That in a book that she finally published uh, at around her 80th birthday, the one monograph as
Yeah.
opposed to just essays that Foote ever published, in the introduction, she says the thing that Elizabeth uh, taught me uh, most about Wittgenstein and his method is that it's hard to think slowly enough. And
Mm,
she says, I think
mm.
maybe publishing this book at 80, maybe I can congratulate myself on having thought slowly enough here. But Foote said, I remember this incident where I got to see Wittgenstein in action. I attended a conversation that he was a part of, and someone was saying something and then trying to back away from it, like saying it and then realizing, oh, that's open to objections. Let me retract
Mm,
that.
mm,
And Wittgenstein said to the guy, no, 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 no. Express the thought, be crude,
mm.
and then we can get on. Say the thing you wanted to say, and let's then like pick it apart. I don't know, like a psychoanalytic
Yeah, yeah.
patient allowing themselves to say the embarrassing thing that they dreamed so that the therapist can pick at it. And there's something about Wittgenstein's method that invites that kind of let yourself think whatever embarrassing thing you're thinking and then ask, why do I
Wow.
think it?
Talk about needing humility, honesty, and patience. Those three things, which in the race to the headlong race to arrive at truth in a modern world of
Mm,
efficiency, those three things, honesty, humility, and patience, don't seem to
yeah.
be in long supply. They seem to be in short supply.
The willingness to be patient, the willingness to be unfinished,
Mm.
and to say, huh, that's puzzling. I need to have an attitude of going on thinking about that. And I don't think that Foote attributes this to Aquinas, but I think of this as one of Aquinas's great virtues as a thinker. We look back. I don't know how much your listeners are going to be familiar with Thomist thought, but like the great achievement of his life is putting together Catholic teaching, the tradition that he's inherited, and the newly discovered philosophical system of Aristotle.
Right.
But when he undertakes to do this, when he undertakes to synthesize these, he doesn't know he's going to succeed.
Yeah.
He just knows he's working on a puzzle.
Yeah.
And I love this about him, and it seems to me this is true of Wittgenstein's approach, and that this is true of all four of these women, this willingness to say, huh, that's hard. Let me sit with that for 3 decades.
Yes, yeah, good one, good one. Joseph Epstein writes, really briefly. I'll tell you, Joseph Epstein, the writer out of Northwestern, he writes about being at a wake for a cousin of his. I think his name was Sherwin Rosen, and Sherwin Rosen was a PhD economist student who ultimately rose to become chair of the economics department at University of Chicago, which is an eminent institution for economics and so on. And Epstein tells a story about how a faculty member relays to Epstein, "We almost failed your cousin Sherwin, who's now passed away. We almost failed him at first because he was so slow to answer questions. We'd ask him a
Huh.
question, and he would kind of defer and so on, but he would come back a month later and have turned this over in his mind and had unpacked and dissected and come back with so many different considerations and insights that it blew we as faculty away. And obviously he rose to great prominence and great success. But the initial intoxication with notions that the smart person answers quickly, the smart person can arrive at truth faster than the less smart person. To your point, let me sit on this for 3 decades and let it simmer. To Wittgenstein's point, why don't you unpack that, unfold it, let it come out, and let's pick it apart. Let's not be rushing on and skip over something that's incredibly instructive. It seems like, wow, what a framework with which to do philosophy.
Yeah. And, not one that lends itself to the production of little journal articles that refine some point of some dominant theory, but an honest way and a fruitful way.
You've mentioned Aquinas. Would you say a word or two about, Anscombe is mentoring Foot, advises that she read St. Thomas Aquinas. And then she also talks about how she didn't necessarily, cite him, but she learned from him and used him almost, kind of his logic was so sound, but she knew that it might not be well received in philosophical circles to be quoting the angelic doctor. How did Elizabeth Anscombe's faith impact her philosophy, and maybe, like you've said, Aquinas in particular? You might have spoken already to Aquinas in particular, but how does her Catholic faith inform her philosophy?
She takes herself to have encountered the truth and to belong to a community that authoritatively propounds the truth. And so, like a lot of Christian thinkers over the years, she sees, like Aquinas himself, she sees herself as trying to fit together and make a coherent whole of what God has revealed in the scriptures and through the magisterium and the teaching of the church, with the rest of what it's available for people inside and outside the church to discover together, regardless of their commitments, regardless of whether they accept that authority. So she's quite traditional in this way. Nothing particularly novel about her approach to this, but she is definitely out of time and place in thinking this way as a philosopher. And so, yeah, her daughter recounts a conversation that she had with her mother, where her mother was saying, like, yeah, I don't cite Aquinas because you bring him up and it makes people react in silly ways. Yeah. So I just use it without telling anyone that I'm using it.
Brilliant.
But you read her book Intention, which is probably the most important and influential thing that she wrote for academic philosophy. And you read the first part of the Prima Secundae, where Aquinas is giving his general account of human action, and you think this is a refined version of atomistic action theory.
Wow.
And she's just not doing the citations and expecting that the people at the Dominican Study House, where she and Peter Geach went regularly for conversations, they'll see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I don't need to worry of people thinking about this as plagiarism.
The Thomas Aquinas is public domain, so we're okay. We're doing okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. One last thing about Elizabeth Anscombe. We've mentioned the kind of kerfuffle about Harry Truman. Could you just tell the story, if you would, or the relationship between Elizabeth Anscombe and C.S. Lewis?
Sure. Yeah. It's nothing simple that Lewis and an evangelical chaplain, Stella Aldwinkle, collaborate together in the early 1940s while these 4 women are undergraduates on the foundation of a new student society at Oxford, the Socratic Club, which is this institution for exploring in an utterly open way, with all sorts of perspectives represented, the deepest theological questions that one can ask. Here's a place for Christians and non-Christians to challenge one another, to engage with one another. Goodness, I wish we had more such institutions now. Anscombe is very admiring of and a regular attender at the Socratic Club. She loves how they would, even before she's working with Wittgenstein, she already has this temperament. She loves how they would carry over a conversation from one meeting to the next because they hadn't gotten to the bottom of it.
Yes.
I'm going to dig more. But Lewis himself, I mean, he's a radio broadcaster, as well as being a distinguished literary scholar. Um, and she sees him as glib,
Hmm.
as wanting to come up with pithy little arguments that people won't know how to answer. Um, and she doesn't specifically comment on this, but I feel in my bones how she would have reacted against the liar, lord, lunatic trichotomy
Sure.
that Lewis is famous for.
Mm.
Like, okay, come on, let's dig a little harder here. Are we sure that it has to be one of those three? I think there's place for what Lewis is doing there in challenging people's assumptions. At the same time, everything I've said about Anscombe already, she wants to make things harder rather than easier.
Yeah, yeah.
And Lewis, she saw as a point scorer. So she's invited to appear at the Socratic in 1948 in February to comment on a chapter from Lewis's newly published book on miracles. And Lewis has this kind of cute argument, this quick look, there's this inconsistency at the heart of any naturalism, as he called it. You can't be a naturalist, meaning someone who thinks that there's nothing but what the natural sciences explore, and have any convictions about the truth of your thoughts, including your thoughts about naturalism. Because if you think that your thoughts are all just the result of random physical phenomena coming together, then why should you trust them? And Anscombe thinks, we can get into the details if you want or not, but she thinks, that's too quick. It's harder than that.
Yeah.
And she takes this argument apart at the Socratic Club, and Lewis is pretty humiliated by it. The consensus of everyone there is that she's raising questions that he doesn't know how to answer. But there's a wonderful epilogue to this for both of them. First of all, they're faculty in the small world of Oxford, and so they continue to have dinners and wine parties together with colleagues. They see one another, and Anscombe reports, look, people thought, he must have kind of like run the other way every time he saw you. And she said, that's ridiculous. We were together a lot. I don't know that they were ever close, but on Lewis's side, we have a letter from him to Stella Aldwinkle where he says, look, she demolished me as an apologist. I think she owes it to the faith to do more apologetics. Will you please invite her to do more things at the Socratic? And the humility and the sense of commitment to the cause that shows on Lewis's part is, I think, intensely admirable.
Yes.
And then Anscombe, long after Lewis's death, in 1981, she's introducing a collection of her essays, and she says, I'm republishing this thing that I presented in debate with Lewis, and I read it again, and I feel like reading my own work, I didn't nearly get to the heart of the problem. Even though I was making it harder, I wasn't making it hard enough, and I so admire that when Lewis went back and revised Miracles late in his life, that he made some changes. He says, I don't think either of us really have gotten to the bottom of this problem. It's a really hard problem, but the fact that he would do that shows this integrity. So each of them came to admire the other in a way that I think is a beautiful model for intellectual, I don't know what word I want here, not antagonists exactly, but people who square it off.
It's interesting because this very story, which was relayed on the floor of the Senate a number of years ago, and it had to do with the lack of civility, in the Senate, and obviously that hasn't changed. If not, it's gotten worse. But it is an interesting thing. I love this story in the sense of what you've described, the dogged pursuit of truth, the humility to recognize where you were wrong, the collegiality to respect each other, even in opposition to one another, and the grace to later on extend greater opportunity to the other to continue their good work, their good pursuit. And again, it's in a very proud intellectual society. And we know we've talked about some of the people that clearly had no shortage of disdain and pride and kind of harsh comments for people who disagreed with them. This is a tremendous series of exchanges that ultimately led to not only a greater pursuit of truth, or maybe a greater arrival of truth, but profound demonstration of grace. I love that story. It's great.
Yeah, I love it too. And at the time, she felt like she had to oppose him,
Yeah.
and her daughter asked her about this too, and tells this story. Uh, why did you feel like you wanted to oppose what would seem to be an argument on the side of the faith?
Mm.
And she gave an answer that reminds me of something that St. Augustine says. She says, we have to combat bad arguments even for conclusions
Amen.
that we hold to ourselves. Augustine says somewhere, I think it might be in the Confessions, like, it's really important that you don't give bad arguments for the truth of the faith, because people will think those are the only arguments that there are.
That's so good. To make it, there's a quick secular example of this too. Lionel Trilling, I think, in the mid 20th century, when there was a waning of a conservative movement, so to speak, it kind of chastised the liberal movement to say, without a robust conservative opposition, we get flabby in our arguments, and we need our sparring partners to arrive at a better place. Now, that's clearly on a different level than these pursuits of eternal truths, but I think kind of strikes a few of the same tones.
Yeah, I agree.
Segment 4, The Enduring Relevance of Philosophy. Reflecting with a touch of disdain on Oxford philosopher Gilbert Ryle, Iris Murdoch wrote, "Ryle's world was one in which people play cricket, cook cakes, make simple decisions, remember their childhood, or go to the circus, not the world in which they commit sins, fall in love, say prayers, or join the Communist Party." Ben, reflecting on the crux of Murdoch's criticism, in these days, is philosophy equipped to wrestle with the grit and grime of everyday life, or is it an abstract parlor game with little relevance for anybody but the pedantic?
I think there's a lot of people who are trying really hard to do public philosophy, public facing philosophy. Um, and I admire this impulse, at least, and much of the work of people like Kieran Satia and Christine Korsgaard, who are writing about our relationships to other animals, about how we confront midlife,
Mm,
and just a whole variety of topics. I think the audience, for a whole lot of complicated reasons, has become small.
hmm.
But the gap will be filled.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit before we started the conversation today about a course that I taught recently, in which we're reading thinkers like Brené Brown and Jordan Peterson and Ibram Kendi, who are, I think, occupying the place that in the ancient world was occupied by Stoic and Epicurean and Platonic philosophers.
Mm,
Uh, and I don't see it having happened yet, where really tremendous intellectual rigor
hmm.
is put in connection with the seeking of wisdom for a whole life. Um, but there are some hopeful signs, along with a lot of perverse stuff that's generated by incentives within the university system, where in order to get a prestigious position and to get tenure at a prestigious position, what you're expected to do is not this public facing stuff,
Yeah.
but to refine some little angle on some little theory.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said. How have the ideas, in your estimation, of Murdoch, Anscombe, Foot, and Midgely, how have they stood the test of time? Do these women, their stories and their ideas still matter?
I think they do. The I think easiest place to see the relevance of what they were doing is in thinking about the way that the fact value dichotomy
Hmm.
that the positivist philosophers like Ayer and the Vienna Circle propounded, the way that's still with us in a popularized form. I talk about this a little bit in the book, that in so many language arts curricula around the United States and indeed around the world, There's an emphasis on teaching the distinction between facts and
Yeah.
opinions. And I can see the point in a world of relentless propaganda of teaching people to ask, how is that sourced?
Yeah.
Let's look at where you got that. Let's be a little bit critical here of that idea being put forward. But the way it's taught in grade schools, it's just the fact value dichotomy all over again,
Mm.
that statements about better and worse, right and wrong, are children are supposed to learn to be sorted into the opinion column rather than the fact column, with the implication that these aren't things you can be right or wrong about. And so I think one use of the philosophical work of these four is for those who demand a more sophisticated treatment, who are gripped by that thought. We talked about being gripped by thoughts, imprisoned within pictures.
Mm.
People who are gripped by that, the philosophical work of these four can help still to liberate someone who just can't imagine an alternative to that way of thinking. That no, there's the world of facts, and then there's all of these essentially groundless opinions that people hold, this stuff you can't be right or wrong about. You can just be noisier or less noisy, more or less propagandistically effective. So I think substantively, they have a lesson to teach us. It makes me sad in a way that they still have that relevance, that we still are so gripped by that. But it's deep in the modern consciousness, and we go on needing that therapy. Beyond that, I think they set for us an example of those intellectual virtues we were talking about earlier,
Mm.
of their patience and their humility and their charity, their willingness to start late, to work slowly, to go on being puzzled, to backtrack.
Yeah, this is this you people really have to read this book, because I do think in the modern world that spends a lot of time telling you what you should think, we should spend a little bit more time on how you should think. And again, example after example that you unfold, and I keep coming back to Anscombe Foot, the of what,
Mm-hmm.
questioning the construct that Foot was kind of trapped in, and liberating her from that construct. This is not a matter of deconstructing to paralysis. It was saying rethink your premises and ask yourself if you can kind of move forward, move anew, because you were sort of you were held back by a bridle. Now you can move forward with where your common sense, your intuition, but also your education can lead you, and so on. And I think that notion of the lens through which you can look at problems, look at things, which like you've said is what Wittgenstein passed on to Anscombe as well. That's true mentorship. That's true formation, true education, in the best of ways. And I just think that this book sings of that. In addition to telling the stories of characters, telling the story of philosophy as it was and as it could be, and so on, it tells a lot about how to think, and the arduous path upon which you are on to arrive there, so to speak.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it gives me a thought that I don't think found its way into the book. It's just impressing itself on me as we talk here, that the pairwise connections between each combination of two of the four over the years, the fact that it was about friendship and not just
Mm,
about reading one another's
yes,
publications is
yes.
pretty crucial to the way they worked, uh, challenging one another and helping one another out of places that they were stuck.
Yeah, wonderful. Last question for you, Ben. How did you find yourself interested in these women, their friendships, and their transformation of ethics? What was the origin?
So I was at the University of Notre Dame, and interested in ethics, not certain what I was going to write my dissertation about, but already thinking, well, probably ethics. I think that interests me most. And my mentor, David Solomon, uh, got us reading the three more philosophically famous of the quartet, this being Anscombe Foot and Murdoch. He put all of them on his 20th century ethical theory syllabus. And he was a big fan. They'd been tremendously influential for him. So I started reading them and reading them appreciatively without thinking at all about the connections between them, just thinking I like their style and I'm persuaded by a number of things that they're arguing for in these writings. And then I became aware through reading Mary Midgley's memoir and her talking about all of them being at Oxford together, being friends together in this really unusual context at the beginning of the Second World War. And I thought, wait, there's this story here. And Houghton is a small teaching-focused liberal arts institution with a fairly classical approach. So my teaching load is significant. That's my calling in life, to be teaching first and researching second. And I thought, I'm really interested in this. And I don't know if anybody else is going to pick this up. But unlike my chiseling away at some project of theory refinement, this is the kind of project that could actually fall to someone whose teaching and administrative responsibilities are more significant. No historian is going to know enough philosophy to write about this, and no philosopher is going to be interested enough in the texture of people's lives and their individual characters to want to dig into that, and that cries out to be told too. Well, let me do it.
Oh, well, and you did it so well. You threaded the needle just perfectly. The story of great philosophical thoughts, but also deep and warm friendship, and it's instructive in the way to think in the modern world. So Ben Lipscomb, professor, author, and expert in 4 philosophical giants of the 20th century. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, Todd, thanks for having me on. It's been an honor and a privilege.
So I've been thinking. The story of Iris Murdoch, Phillipa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Mary Midgley, as told by Benjamin Lipscomb, is so much more than the story of brilliant women navigating innumerable obstacles in a man's world of early 20th century Oxford. Now, don't get me wrong. The discrimination and double standards that this quartet and so many others had to endure to simply get a place at the intellectual table is a tale that deserves to be told and is, quite simply, story enough. But Benjamin Lipscomb doesn't stop there, because these philosophers' stories are so much more. The Women Are Up to Something unfolds the intellectual battles waged by a stormy novelist and a curmudgeonly genius, a comprehensive thinker and a big-picture synthesizer, against a haughty, entrenched school of philosophical positivism best reserved for parlor games instead of the real-world troubles each one of us has to face. Iris Murdoch criticized the insular, impractical thinking of ordinary language philosopher Gilbert Ryle, saying, quote, Ryle's world was one in which people play cricket, cook cakes, make simple decisions, remember their childhood, or go to the circus, not the world in which they commit sins, fall in love, say prayers, or join the Communist Party, close quote. The thought of Murdoch, Anscombe, Foot, and Midgley pressed, even shook their comfortable colleagues with deep-seated worldviews. If philosophy is truly the love of wisdom, then ought we not pursue and use wisdom for the sake of living wise and meaningful lives? To do that means to cultivate an imagination like Murdoch, turn every stone like Anscombe, teach and be taught like Foot, and keep the big picture forever in front of you like Midgley. One of my favorite anecdotes in Benjamin Lipscomb's book was a moment of breakthrough. Elizabeth Anscombe and Phillipa Foot are engaged in their evening ritual of philosophical discussion and debate. Anscombe was trying to make a particular point that was not penetrating Foot's intellectual defenses. Subscribing to a paradigm that she should be discarding, Foot said that some statement must involve a mixture of, quote, descriptive and evaluative meaning, close quote. And Anscombe erupted. Of what? What? In that moment, Foot experienced an epiphany. Quote, one doesn't have to accept that distinction. One can say what? Close quote. To be a good thinker requires a humility to learn, a hunger for truth, and a penchant for thinking clearly. Hubris, self-deception, and sloppy thinking sound the death knell for wisdom. In an age of programs and ideology, talking points, and self-censorship, we would do well to learn from the very best of thinkers. The Women Are Up to Something introduces us to a quartet with whom we can begin. And one last thing. For this week's book, I would recommend Professor Benjamin Lipscomb's The Women Are Up to Something, but I would also recommend picking up G.E.M. Anscombe and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition, edited by John Mazzoni, Philip Pegan, and Jeffrey Carabin. In this collection of essays about the life and thought of Elizabeth Anscombe, no surprise my favorite among the group, you will find thoughtful reflections on Anscombe and Catholic moral theory, double effect, and embryos, souls, and persons. It is a digestible introduction to the towering and feisty mind of a philosophical genius. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.